Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm very excited for because I'm going to be doing a reading wrap-up. Now, in the past few weeks, I've read a total of 8 books, which I personally don't think is too bad. I just checked and I'm actually ahead by 1 book for my yearly reading goal. I'm definitely trying to pick up the pace of it going in the second half of this year. Given how my attention span has been these past few months, I'm going to take this as a win. Now, for this wrap-up, I do have quite a variety of books. I've been having a bit of a sci-fi kick. I've also been reading some contemporary romance. I, of course, have fantasy to talk about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first 2 books I have to show off are part of the same series, and that is the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. I have now completed the first 4 short stories within this world, and I am having a blast. I love Murderbot so much. I love the plot and the world that Martha Wells has created, and I recently heard that they're actually adopting this series into a television show on Apple TV, and I could not be more excited for it. I feel like it's going to work so well on television too. But I read the 3rd book, which is Rouge Protocol, and the 4th book, which is Exit Strategy. Basically, if you're not familiar, the Murderbot Diaries introduces us to our main character, Murderbot. And Murderbot basically hacked its own mainframe to allow itself to live freely within this sci-fi world, and now no longer has to answer to coding or orders kind of put into it by its creator, if you will. Murderbot is struggling. Murderbot is depressed. Murderbot just wants to spend all of its time watching its favorite television shows. It doesn't really want to interact with anyone, but it also wants to figure out kind of the origin of who it is, also figure out what it wants to do in the future, and along the way you basically follow Murderbot as it works alongside humans and other robots to find answers, and also just sort of gets wrapped up in a variety of conspiracies and issues. It is truly the perfect balance of like great character work, action, humor, and so much heart. Murderbot, who anchors this story at the core, is just so unbelievably likable. I love the character so much, but I also just love seeing Murderbot problem solve and make friends begrudgingly. It's just a really heartwarming and charming story, but it still has like a lot of action and conspiracy too to sort of work through. The balance of the plotting is great. I'm also really enjoying the short story structure of this world because every book definitely is a continuation of the previous one. The story definitely continues, but every story almost reads like an episode of one of Murderbot's like favorite holograms. And I sort of just feel like it fits into the narrative style of the story so well. I just love it. And every book seemingly just gets better and better. I think I'd give both of these books 5 stars. I'm just like really in my short story era, and I love Murderbot immensely. From there, I was craving even more sci-fi, so I decided to pick up book 1 to a super popular series, and that is Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruccio. This book is seemingly everywhere, and this is the first book to a rather long space opera series. I would describe this series from a genre point of view as a really interesting mix of sci-fi and fantasy. I would sort of describe it as written like an epic high fantasy story, but the setting and obviously some of the technological aspects are very sci-fi leaning, but a lot of the world building, again, leans very fantasy. So it's a really fun mix of genres, and as a fantasy sci-fi lover, I've been having a lot of fun with the structure and setup of the story itself. This story introduces us to our main character, Hadrian, and structurally how this book is told is Hadrian's telling his life story to us. We basically get a sense that Hadrian is a very notorious figure within this galaxy. Some view him as a hero. Some say he is the greatest villain that has ever existed. And obviously, as a reader, and as we're told, truth sort of lies somewhere in the middle, and it's up to us to draw our own conclusions. Hadrian, again, is sort of recounting his life and story to us. And in book 1, we find Hadrian as a child. We watch him grow up into his adolescence, have to come to terms of his aristocratic upbringing. We see him as a young man sort of turn away from his family and have to face hardship for the very first time. We see him train, make friends, make allies, make enemies, and basically find himself in the center of a lot of political machinations that are going on around him. In a word, I would say I really enjoyed this book. I didn't love this book. I went in with a lot of expectations, and I just sort of get the feeling that book 1 is very much a setup novel. As you're reading the story, you clearly get the sense that this is a very large and expansive series, and based on the amount of books in this series, it makes sense. So book 1 is really just introducing us to our main character, Hadrian, letting us get to know who he is at his core, his motivations, some of the elements of his backstories that sort of fundamentally make him who he is. I think because of that, I feel like book 1 reads a little bit more like a prequel. Sometimes it almost feels like a collection of short stories sort of put together, so we get to experience all of these different different chapters in Hadrian's life. By the end of book 1, I do really feel like the politics are beginning to heat up, and I feel like the story is really going to begin to grow in the later installments. So I'm definitely intrigued to keep going. I really, really like the world. The writing style I was also really impressed by. I just felt like there was a little bit left to be desired in terms of the plot pacing and just the overall structure and characterization of some of the side characters. But I'm really obsessed with this sort of medieval fantasy inspired sci-fi world. I think it's a really cool balance of like archaic political structures and technology. Sort of has a retrofuturism element too. It just has a lot of strong stuff going for it in the background. I'm just looking forward to hopefully falling more and more in love with the series as I continue to progress. But I would give book 1 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely worth a pickup, but I wouldn't say it was as extraordinary as a lot of people say it is. But I still liked it. From there, I went on a bit of a contemporary romance reading marathon. I was reading a lot of intense sci-fi, and I just wanted something light and fun to cheer up my day. So I read a lot of Emily Henry. First and foremost, I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. I've already lent this out to a friend because I honestly found it to be completely delightful, hilarious, and such a good time. The setup and synopsis of Funny Story, which is Emily Henry's newest release, is just great in my opinion. And in this story, we're introduced to our main character, Daphne. And at the beginning of this book, Daphne basically finds herself stranded in a very small Midwestern town in Michigan. She recently moved here with her fiance because this is his hometown, and he dreamed of sort of settling down here and spending the rest of his life here with his wife. Unfortunately for her, her life is basically turned upside down because shortly before her wedding, Daphne's ex, Peter, decides that he actually is in love with his best friend, calls off the wedding, breaks up with Daphne, and Daphne herself is looking to desperately move out of this small town, but she also really loves her job here as a children's librarian. Shortly after her breakup though, she basically needs to find a new place to live, so she decides to move in with her ex-fiance's new girlfriend's ex because they both left their partners for each other, and his name is Miles. While Daphne is really buttoned up, Miles appears to be the exact opposite. Now that these two exes are roommates, they really don't spend a lot of time with each other until one fateful night when they get really drunk and decide to RSVP to their ex's wedding to go together to get revenge. That's right, this is a fake dating forced proximity, small town romance, and it was a blast. This book was funny. It was entertaining. I loved the Michigan setting and absolutely screams summer. The chemistry and tension that existed between Daphne and Miles was amazing. I was absolutely giggling and kicking my feet throughout this entire book. It was just the perfect balance of things, and something that I appreciate in general about Emily Henry's writing is that while she definitely centers romance and she paces her romance out really well, every book that I've read of hers does really center solo journeys for both of our main characters. It has an emotional core, which I feel like adds an additional layer to the books that just makes them really hit home harder. I love seeing Daphne sort of work through some of the things that she has been putting off as it relates to her family. I love seeing Miles kind of gain confidence in himself and in his own passions, and I love seeing them together. And again, forced proximity, fake dating, I'm sold. I loved this book. Honestly, I would give it like 5 stars. From a contemporary romance point of view, I had a blast. From there, I decided the only logical next step was read more Emily Henry. So I also read Happy Place by this author. I was curious going into this one because I feel like this is a book either people really, really enjoy or dislike the most within all of her installments. Happy Place is also much more of an ensemble book, which I was just curious about reading going in. This story introduces us to our two main characters, Harriet and Wynne. And Harriet and Wynne have been dating for a very long time, almost 10 years. They met one summer many years prior because all of their friends basically come together every single year and go to this house in Maine. They're all super close, and Harriet and Wynne have been inseparable ever since. However, though, they're harboring a huge secret, and that is that they broke up, and they have not told their friends yet, and they're planning on this trip to sort of reveal the news, but due to a variety of circumstances, they don't feel comfortable doing so, and now they're continuing to fake date around their friends. This is a book that I personally ate up. The level of angst and drama that exists within this story is on another level, and I also really appreciated the sort of story we got to follow with Harriet and Wynne. Often when I feel like I'm reading a romance story, it's kind of the coming together of two people who have just met or are sort of exploring a romantic relationship for the first time, but instead we get to follow Harriet and Wynne sort of in a second chance scenario. We're reading chapters of many summers of their past, getting to know them as a couple and separately, and you sort of get to see like the desperate love that they have for one another in present day, creating this tension and angst that I simply loved immensely. Yes, this book definitely centers a lot of miscommunication, and if you don't like that trope, which I would say I generally don't like that trope either, this can be a frustrating book, but I feel like she balances that miscommunication with so much desperate longing, it just becomes impossible to put down. Every scene feels charged, it feels emotional, and I also feel like elements of the miscommunication are founded even if they're so desperately annoying. Like, don't get me wrong, I wanted to shake both Harriet and Wen like throughout this entire book, but that didn't stop me from just like speed reading the entire thing because I couldn't put it down. Like, two things can be true at once, and I actually really enjoyed this book immensely. I also really appreciated the sort of friendship element of this. I know that the friendships don't necessarily land for everyone, but I do feel like it can be a realistic portrayal of how friends can shift and change through time, again, especially through many, many years, and how you sort of desperately try to hold on to the facade of how you once were because you don't really want to confront how you've changed. And while you definitely feel like you love someone, you're scared to see if you can change alongside them and have your relationship sort of transform into something new. So I appreciated, again, the sort of emotional backing of this book and the present and past timelines as they began to intertwine together. And again, I just cannot understate the level of angst and love and desperation that you feel from page 1 in this. It was just something I absolutely devoured. And in fact, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think Happy Place might be my favorite Emily Henry book. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I loved how imperfect everyone was, and I could not get enough of this book. And then the last Emily Henry book I read recently was Book Lovers. I feel like this might be her most popular one, and I can definitely see and understand why. In Book Lovers, Emily Henry is sort of deconstructing the well-known small-town romance, sort of turning a lot of those elements of those romance stories on its head. It's funny and clever and insightful, and it also centers two book lovers, which, hey, what's there not to like? In this book, we're following our two main characters, Nora and Charlie. Nora lives in New York City, and she's a very successful book agent. She loves her job. She's kind of like a stereotypical boss babe, if you will, and something has been happening to Nora over and over and over again, and that is that her boyfriends visit a small town, and there they meet a boutique hotel owner or a baker or a florist. They fall in love, they leave the city, they leave Nora, and they settle down in this new place. And this has happened to Nora numerous times. Nora herself is not too bothered because, again, she lives a really structured life, and she also doesn't really let herself get too close to people due to her upbringing, where she had a wonderful mother who was a little bit chaotic, and she was also put in a situation at a young age to look after and raise her sister. At the beginning of the story, Nora meets Charlie at sort of a work lunch, and they do not like each other immediately. They butt heads basically right away, and Nora assumes that she'll never see Charlie again. However, though, Nora finds herself in a very small town after her sister plans a sister trip, not only break this small town curse Nora seems to have, but also to spend a lot of sisterly time. But lo and behold, who does she run into? Charlie. And from there, we watch a really fun small town romance begin to unfurl. We have sort of a rivals to lovers situation, which is very endearing. As characters, I really appreciated Nora and Charlie's romance. I found Nora to be a really refreshing take on just like a really focused career woman who loves her life, who loves her job, who loves living in the city, and feels really fulfilled with a lot of the choices she's made. That being said, though, I also love watching her transformation to allowing herself to be vulnerable and to allow other people to care for her. It was really lovely. Not to mention Charlie's journey was equally really nice to follow. I really liked this book. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Emily Henry, but I do feel like there's a lot of really fun elements in this. I would still highly recommend this, and I gave it like a 4 out of 5 stars. Alrighty, moving on, I have some fantasy to talk about. First things first, I have Rise of Empire, the second book in the Raya Revelation series by Michael J. Sullivan. These are bind-ups comprised of 2 books, and I read the first book in this installment, so I guess technically book 3, if you will, within the Raya Revelations. This is a series centering our two main characters, Royce and Hadrian, and it's set in the same world that Michael J. Sullivan has built across all of his series. The first series I read of his was The Legends of the First Empire, which is set thousands of years prior to the start of this series, so a lot has changed now following our two main characters, Royce and Hadrian, who are mercenaries for hire. They find themselves in book 1 basically wrapped up in this conspiracy, and they're kind of thrown headfirst into dangerous things. I enjoy this series. I find it to be really comforting and classic. I would say the characterizations and the plots themselves are very straightforward in a lot of aspects, like predictable. That being said, though, going into the second bind-up, I heard a lot of really positive things that this series continued to improve, and I would say it definitely did. I found a lot of improvement in the writing style from Michael J. Sullivan within this book, but also just the plot itself felt much larger. I felt like there was a lot more stakes. I felt like there was a lot more directions to kind of follow our characters as they're moving through this world. Just the overall universe felt much more expanded, and we were also following more POV characters than we ever had before, which I appreciated. Structurally, I would sort of describe this book as like a classic classic empire trying to take over the realm. We have kingdoms trying to fight back. We got magical forces trying to get themselves involved, and they're meddling within everything. There's fates and gods and ancient magic at play. We got lost heirs running around. Like, it has a lot of classic elements to it, but it is also a lot of fun. And I would say this series is very much anchored by two very likable characters, which are Royce and Hadrian, and their banter, their friendship, and their camaraderie are just a great thing to read. But again, I feel like some additional characters that were added within this really expanded the quality of the story. And I would actually say the two new characters that I read from are two of my favorite characters within the series in general. In fact, even more so than Royce and Hadrian, if I'm being honest. I'm looking forward to finishing this bind up and moving on to the third bind up, which is the Heir of Novaron, and just kind of seeing how this entire story wraps up. This isn't a perfect fantasy series, but it's kind of something that's like perfect to me in its imperfectness. Hopefully that makes sense. I would probably give the first book in this bind up like a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but at the same time, I really liked it, like, for what it was, you know? The last book I read for this reading wrap-up was an absolute doozy. I mean, oh my gosh, the ride and journey that this book took me on, like, I'm still sort of reeling from it, processing it, kind of wrapping my head around it, if you will, and that is Blood Over Bright Haven by Emma Wong. This book will do a lot of things, and I highly recommend picking this up. This is actually a fantasy standalone, which in general I feel like is just very rare for the genre, and Emma Wong in particular has such a skill with just creating like such whole and rich worlds, really complex and like wild plots, fitting so much great characterization and like not a lot of space. I felt the same when I read The Sword of Kaigen. Like, I have no idea how she was able to fit all those different plot movements within a standalone novel and flesh out such a wholly realized world with a complex magic system, but she does. And she does it again in Blood Over Bright Haven. But in this book, we're introduced to our two main characters, Thamil and Skonia. Skonia herself is a very talented maid, and she has been working at her craft since the age of 4, and she is determined to get into something called the High Magistry, which no other woman has done before. At the beginning of this book, she has successfully done it because she's simply too good for them to ignore any further. It finally feels like she has overcome all the barriers in her life that were there previously, but unfortunately for her, when she begins working at the High Magistry, things sort of get worse. None of her colleagues want to work with her. They basically try to sabotage her work by assigning her a janitor for a research assistant, and this janitor is actually our other main character, Thamil. This book is also set in kind of an industrial utopian society. Here, everything is run by magic, controlled again by the High Magistry. The magic itself is a really complex thing that I loved learning about. It basically sort of works like magical coding. Skonia herself is a very talented mapper. You basically pull magic from another world and then apply it through like really complex scripts to make it work a certain way within their world. This is a dark academia leading fantasy story, but I also feel like based on the synopsis, it really tries to present itself in one specific way, but like, do not be fooled. The plot balloons in a lot of directions and is really, 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 really intense. Skonia herself as a character is very, very flawed, but one that is so fascinating to follow, and I feel like anchors the story so well. And her relationship with Thamil and just their stories themselves are just like a fascinating thing to read. Let me just say, like, there are a lot of decisions made in this book. There's a lot of mysteries to uncover, and there is a lot that happens in this. And honestly, I don't feel like the author could have ended it any other way than she did, and I was really impressed that she decided to go there. And honestly, I just respect this book a lot, and I would highly recommend it. I would give it like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Alrighty guys, that is my reading wrap up of all of the books I've read recently. Please let me know down below some books you've read recently, as I would love to know, and I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!